There was a morning kitchen that looked almost identical in nearly every American home in the 1960s. A box turned to face one particular chair, so the cartoon printed on the front was the very last thing a kid saw before the day asked anything of them. The light through the window still had that early grey quality to it. The television hadn't warmed up yet. Somewhere a screen door hadn't slammed shut for the day, a dog was still asleep on the linoleum, and on that table, more mornings than not, sat a bowl that felt like it belonged entirely to whoever was sitting in front of it. Almost none of what filled that shelf of boxes still exists. Nobody in that kitchen ever marked the last morning they poured it. There was no warning, no final box set aside as a keepsake. 1 week the cereal was simply there, the way it always had been, and then at some point it wasn't, and by the time anyone thought to look for it again, it had already slipped past being a product and become something closer to a memory instead. 10 of those cereals are still out there, kept alive only by the people who ate them. A few were genuine national hits, backed by cartoons, jingles, a small plastic toy buried somewhere near the bottom of every box. And one of them never really disappeared at all, not completely. To this day, people track down reissues online the moment a box quietly reappears, the way you'd chase news of an old friend who resurfaces once every few years and then goes quiet again. By the end of this, you'll know exactly which one that is. We're a long way from there yet, though, because before any of these 10 vanished, they belonged to something bigger than themselves. Not a company, not a grocery aisle. A whole version of morning that quietly doesn't exist the same way anymore. One most people haven't thought to miss until right now. Pouring your own cereal was one of the first things a kid ever did entirely without help. No parent standing over the bowl, measuring anything. Just a rough guess at how much milk was enough, poured a little too high some mornings, a little too low on others, and nobody minding either way. It sounds like nothing. At 6 years old, it was practice at being a person who made small decisions alone. The box did more work than most people give it credit for now. Before the television found its picture, before anyone else in the house was fully awake, that box was the only entertainment available. Read start to finish, then read again. Not because there was anything new printed on the back, but because a kid at 6 in the morning has never once been picky about what he rereads. Saturday mornings were their own separate category entirely. Nobody rushed. The cereal came out slower, eaten in pajamas, in front of cartoons that felt like they existed just for that one morning and no other. The milk would sit long enough to change colour a little by the time the show ended, and nobody minded that either. That version of a morning, unsupervised, unhurried, entirely a kid's own, doesn't really happen the same way now. And then there was the toy. Sometimes the toy was the entire reason a cereal got chosen off the shelf in the first place, fought over by siblings in the back seat on the way home. One of them already scheming about which bowl he'd claim first the next morning, just so he'd be the one to reach it before anyone else woke up. But by the time most of those same kids had children of their own, more than half of what filled that shelf back then had already disappeared completely. Almost none of them noticed it happening in real time. It's the kind of loss that only becomes visible looking backward, standing in a modern cereal aisle decades later, quietly wondering what used to sit exactly where a different box sits now. Because here's the part that surprises most people. The reasons behind these 10 disappearances were rarely about taste at all. Something else connects nearly all of them, something that won't become fully clear until we reach the very end of this list. A few of these cereals didn't fade the way you'd expect either. Some were pulled while kids were still asking for them by name in grocery store aisles, and the real reasons behind that still catch people off guard today. So we'll start where every ending on this list begins, quietly and a little too soon. In the late 1960s, Kellogg's released a cereal shaped like small twisted loops, dyed in colours that had no real reason to exist in food, sold with an almost circus-like sense of fun that stood out from the flakes and squares crowding the rest of the shelf. They called it Corn Crackos. It didn't last long, barely more than a year on shelves before it disappeared, which makes it one of the shortest-lived cereals of its entire era. For the kids who happened to catch it during that brief window, the shape and the colour were enough to make it feel like a genuine discovery, something none of their friends had yet at their own kitchen table. It never had the chance to become a habit before it vanished. Most people who remember it at all aren't entirely sure of the name anymore. Just the shape, just the colour. A fragment of a memory with the label worn off completely. It barely had time to become a memory before it became one anyway. That wasn't the only cereal that disappeared before most kids finished loving it, though. The next one vanished for a reason that had nothing to do with taste at all. It had everything to do with how crowded that same shelf was about to become. Around the same stretch of years, a frosted, ring-shaped cereal called Frostios carried a lighter, sweeter twist on the plain oat rings, already familiar at breakfast tables everywhere. The sweetness alone made it feel like a treat rather than routine, the kind of box a kid specifically requested by name at the store, tugging a cart toward it before a parent could steer anywhere else. But as similar frosted cereals kept multiplying on that same shelf through the decade, the less prominent names were the first ones trimmed quietly to make room for whichever version was already winning. Frostios never really failed. It simply got crowded out by cereals doing almost exactly what it did, just a little louder, with a little more advertising behind them. It wasn't rejected, it was quietly outnumbered. Being outnumbered is one way for something to disappear. The next cereal on this list vanished a stranger way, because of the very toy that made kids love it in the first place, which tells you almost everything about how cereal used to be sold to children. Years before that decade had even started sliding toward its end, Kellogg's had already tried something unusual, a cereal called OKs, shaped into a distinctive form unlike most of what sat nearby, built around a mascot that gave an otherwise ordinary box a personality of its own. It arrived in the late 1950s and held on only into the very first years of the 60s, a narrow window that still overlaps with the childhoods this whole video is built around. The shape and the character gave it a playfulness that plainer cereals hadn't bothered attempting yet. But as bigger names launched through the decade with bigger budgets and louder mascots, a quieter early product like this one didn't stand much of a chance. It got phased out, absorbed into a wave of flashier competitors that, in a strange way, owed something to the idea it had already proven could work. It helped invent a whole idea of fun breakfast, and then it was the first thing forgotten about it. An early idea can disappear quietly enough that almost nobody notices. A beloved mascot disappearing, though, is never quiet at all. And the next cereal's mascot is one that some people still specifically ask about by name decades later. Twinkles arrived a little further into the decade, built around a cheerful character and a flavour soft and sweet enough that it became an instant favourite specifically among the youngest kids at the table. The mascot did more work than the cereal itself ever could have alone. Kids weren't loyal to a flavour profile, not really. They were loyal to a face they recognised the second the box came out of the cabinet, before the lid was even off. As the company behind it began narrowing its lineup toward the characters and flavours performing best, smaller names like this one were quietly retired to focus resources where the numbers made the clearest case. Within a year or two, other mascot-driven cereals with bigger marketing budgets had absorbed almost its entire young audience. The flavour could have been recreated easily enough by anyone who wanted to try. The character never was. Losing a mascot is one particular kind of quiet heartbreak. The next cereal disappeared for something bigger than any single company's decision. An entire category of cereal fell out of favour almost all at once, and almost nobody at the time understood exactly why. Rice Crinkles stood out on shelves specifically because of its colour, a bright, almost startling shade that turned an entire bowl of milk a slightly different tint by the time breakfast was finished. At a moment when most cereals still looked fairly plain, that alone made it feel like something worth choosing over anything sitting next to it. But through the back half of the decade, the company behind it began streamlining its cereal lineup, folding overlapping identities together rather than keeping every individual name alive. Rice Crinkles wasn't erased so much as absorbed. Its specific identity quietly merged into whatever newer, similarly colourful cereal came along next, carrying much of what made it interesting without carrying its actual name forward. It didn't disappear completely, it just wasn't allowed to keep its own name anymore. That one dissolved into something else entirely. The next one disappeared because of a decision that had nothing to do with cereal at all. It had to do with what companies were even allowed to say to children, and that decision quietly reshaped Saturday morning television for good. Quake arrived built entirely around a bold mining-themed mascot, and an ad campaign that felt less like a commercial and more like a tiny cartoon episode of its own, airing right alongside the actual cartoons kids were already watching. Introduced in the mid-1960s alongside a companion serial, it built real, lasting popularity through the back half of the decade. Kids picked it specifically because of the character, not because anyone had bothered explaining the flavour to them first. But by the early 1970s, changing standards around advertising to children, paired with shifting company priorities, led to its discontinuation. Its remaining audience got folded quietly into its sibling cereal, while the mascot itself simply stopped appearing anywhere at all. No farewell episode, no explanation, just an absence where a familiar face used to be every single Saturday morning. One half of the pair survived, the other simply stopped being made. That was a mascot losing his own cereal. The next entry is the opposite, a cereal that lost its mascot to something far stranger than any advertising standard, and it might be the strangest disappearance on this entire list. Quisp was sold as the sibling to the cereal we just lost, built around a small alien character who became genuinely, specifically beloved in a way most cereal mascots never quite managed. But unlike almost everything else on this list, Quisp never technically disappeared for good. It simply vanished from regular shelves for stretches of years at a time, occasionally reappearing without warning before fading out again, treated by its own company as a lower priority, even as the kids who loved it grew quietly more devoted with every disappearance. Nothing ever fully replaced it, because its absence became part of what it was, a cereal defined as much by not being there as by anything it actually tasted like. And somehow, that specific unpredictability, never knowing whether this would be a year you could find it or a year you couldn't, became its own strange kind of tradition, passed down the way a family passes down a story. It never really left. It just taught an entire generation what it felt like to miss something on purpose. That one taught people how to wait. The next one never gave anyone the chance to. When it disappeared completely, and it still quietly upsets people to talk about even now, decades later. Freakies wasn't just a cereal. It was 6 original cartoon characters and an entire invented mythology printed directly onto the box. An ongoing story that gave a kid a reason to come back to the same breakfast table, morning after morning, for something beyond the taste alone. It technically arrived just past the decade this video is centered on, but it became one of the most mourned disappearances among the very kids who'd grown up through the 60s, waiting for something exactly like it to exist. The depth of it was the whole appeal. 6 distinct personalities, ongoing chapters, small collectible pieces tucked inside that connected to a larger story, unfolding box by box, week by week. But maintaining something that layered and character-heavy became expensive fast, and as serial marketing strategy shifted through the mid-1970s, it was quietly discontinued in favour of simpler, single mascot serials that never attempted anything close to the same kind of storytelling. Decades later, people still trade original boxes and toys online, not really as collectibles if you ask them honestly, but as fragments of something they clearly weren't ready to let go of. It wasn't just a cereal that ended, it was a whole invented world that quietly closed its doors, with nobody standing outside to notice the lights go off. Losing an imaginary world is its own specific kind of grief. The next entry on this list is about losing something real instead, not a character, but a place, and an entire kind of Saturday morning that doesn't exist in the same form anymore either. Sir Grapefellow and Baron von Redbury were sold as rivals, 2 competing cereals built around mascots who staged an ongoing, good-natured feud across Saturday morning commercials. A small joke that somehow made an ordinary cereal choice feel like picking a side in something. Released in the early 1970s, each cereal built its own small army of devoted kids who defended their pick the way you'd defend a favourite team, with genuine, if slightly ridiculous loyalty. The rivalry was the entire appeal. Choosing one over the other felt like it meant something. A small, harmless allegiance built entirely around breakfast, argued over in school hallways and on bus rides, where it briefly felt like the most important disagreement in the world. But as the broader wave of character-driven serials fell out of favour through the decade, both were quietly discontinued within a few years of each other, and neither one was ever directly replaced. The specific idea of 2 competing mascot serials feuding for a kid's loyalty every single Saturday morning simply stopped being made at all. The rivalry outlived the serials, only the argument is still remembered. Losing a pair like that is one kind of ending. The final cereal on this list is the one people still ask about more than any other name we've mentioned so far, and its disappearance is tied to something bigger than any single breakfast table. It's tied to an entire American morning quietly dimming 1 year at a time, until almost nobody could say exactly when it had gone. Kaboom arrived, built around brightly coloured marshmallow pieces and a warm, jovial clown mascot, and it became one of the most requested cereals among kids specifically, because it felt like dessert wearing breakfast as a disguise. Released in the late 1960s, it held on far longer than almost anything else on this list. Not disappearing suddenly, but slowly diminishing, shrinking into a smaller and smaller form on fewer and fewer shelves across the decades that followed, the way a porch light left on gradually dims before anyone thinks to change the bulb. The marshmallow pieces made every single bowl feel slightly different depending on what a kid scooped up first, and the mascot's warmth made the whole thing feel less like a product and more like a small ritual, belonging only to whoever was eating it that particular morning. But as nutritional standards tightened and advertising regulations around sugar and mascots shifted over the decades that followed, its bright colours and character-driven marketing became harder and harder to justify, until it was phased out entirely. Of everything on this list, Kaboom is the one that survived the longest while fading the slowest. Not a sudden disappearance, but a dimming so gradual that most people never marked the actual morning it finally ended. To this day, it remains one of the most requested cereal revivals among adults who grew up pouring it into their own bowl, more than almost any other name on this entire list. It didn't vanish overnight. It quietly dimmed for years until one morning, without anyone marking the date, the bowl was simply empty for good. None of these 10 disappearances were really about cereal. Not one of them. They were about a version of morning that's become almost unreachable now. A kitchen table with nobody rushing anyone, a box turned deliberately to face one particular chair, a bowl of milk slowly changing colour while a cartoon played on a television that had only just finished warming up. A whole way of starting the day quietly wrapped itself around 10 different boxes, and when the boxes disappeared, so did the specific unsupervised half-awake independence that used to live inside that 1 hour before school. People rarely miss the cereal itself. They miss the version of the morning it used to belong to. And somewhere in that list sits the one cereal that never fully vanished at all. The alien mascot disappearing and reappearing for decades, still tracked down online today by people who learned, as kids, exactly what it felt like to miss something and then get it back, just long enough to have to miss it again. The table is probably still there. The chair might even still be there. But the version of you who once sat in it, alone in the quiet of an early morning, choosing a whole day's mood based on which box happened to be facing you, that's the only thing on this entire list that never came back.